So welcome to lecture number 9. Today we'll explore some of the implications of the Sadrowski model for inflation, and in particular high inflation that we don't observe very often in the real world, but we do observe it, and we're observing it in several countries today. That's the Cagan model. And I'll discuss, review the stuff that we did last week, and I'll talk about the role of the future in the present. That's one of the most important insights of the Kagan model, is that the expectations of the future influence the current equilibrium, the currently observed price level, and therefore the currently observed inflation rate. Therefore, surprises to information in the current period will affect these variables, even though they're not observed in real time. So the role of expectations, anticipations, whether they're rational or not is a different question, but their importance is undisputed in macroeconomics. And we'll explore the role of expectations in general in macroeconomics, and this will be the segue to the second part of the course, which deals with short-run fluctuations. So next week I'll talk about fluctuations of the economy measured as GDP or measured in terms of the consumption that agents have chosen to undertake, or investment they're undertaking in relation to some long-run trend. And these fluctuations we call the business cycle. And that's probably the most important dimension of interest of the second half of the course, which is the business cycle and how to understand it. The first part has been, of course, economic growth and understanding the separation of price and price level from the real goings-on in the economy. Last time, we did a lot of important stuff. We used the Pontryagin maximum principle to look at a different set of issues, namely the role of money, and we took the Sadrowski model as an excellent springboard into this issue, the idea of money entering the utility function indirectly for the reasons that I've spoken about, that it helps us undertake transactions, it helps us to make transactions more efficiently. Therefore, if we can enjoy more real purchasing power in the form of money, it makes us better off. But of course, that has a cost, and the cost shows up in the inflation rate. And the inflation rate plus the opportunity cost of holding real assets, because we're holding some of our wealth in the form of money, so it may not seem like a very intelligent thing to do, especially if inflation is high, but it does give us utility. So the Kagan model is a derivation of that, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about how inflation gets started. I'll talk about the Phillips curve, which is probably the most famous example of inductive economics around. I'll talk about the conclusion from the Phillips curve that just looking at an empirical stylized fact is not enough. We have to have some microeconomic foundations, and one of those foundations we've already sort of looked at in the OLG model, and you can adjust that model to allow for labor supply, and we can come very close to that, to understanding why anticipations and deviations of anticipations from the realization of those variables can cause economies to deviate from their long-run levels. And this is what we have called in the past the Lucas Island model. I will not go into it in too much detail today, but it will come back later on in the course. So the Kagan model is a way of thinking about hyperinflation, which is a situation when the rate of growth of the price level is extreme. An arbitrary definition says when the price level increases by 50% or more per month, we have a situation we call hyperinflation. It's a very arbitrary definition, but clearly when prices are rising at that rate, you really pay a huge price for ignoring the inflation rate at any period of time. In fact, even in the height of the Weimar Republic, it was very important to spend the money quickly, which just means you don't want to hold real balances given the evolution of the price level that you anticipate. It seems to be a recurrent problem. We have high inflation in countries like Venezuela and Turkey. in recent years, the recent decades. We've had countries in Eastern Europe, including the Ukraine and Croatia and Serbia, that had sporadically high inflation. I gave you the example of Bulgaria. I'll talk about it again. The Kagan model is an implication of Sadrowski. Okay, so it basically shows that the demand for money in real terms, taking the nominal money supply, dividing it by the price level, is really a function of people's anticipation of the opportunity cost, the real opportunity cost of holding that money, which to a large component is the inflation rate. For that reason, high rates of money growth that are anticipated in the future will show up in the present, because high rates of money growth in the future will be associated with high rates of inflation, and high rates of inflation in the future impact my demand for money today, and therefore the price level today. For this reason, it's not easy to defeat inflation, because you have to convince the economic agents that are holding the money to hold more of it. In a sense, please expose yourself to this risk of inflation. And if agents aren't willing to do that, it's because they don't believe that the promise of lower inflation will be realized. Therefore, the expectation of inflation is a crucial element of the demand for money. And it's also a statement about the credibility of promises that the government may make or the central bank may make concerning the path of money in the future. So we'll have to ask the question, what drives those inflationary expectations? Let's revise and review the situation in Germany. In 1922, which was the year of the hyperinflation, one might say. Of course, it extended into 1923, but the inflation really started going in 1922. The price level was, if you normalize it to having a value of 1 in January, within a year it was 16 times higher. So that's a situation one can hardly imagine in the current environment. But if you went to Zimbabwe in 2007 or 8, you would have observed exactly the same type of evolution. However, in Zimbabwe in 2008, we had really a situation that one observed in Germany in 1923. So the notion of a rapidly rising price level is not enough. It's actually an accelerating level of prices, which means the inflation rate is increasing rather dramatically. So again, this is not a measure of inflation that I'm showing you. This is a measure of the price level. The price level rose by 75-fold. What I said before was not quite right. The supply of currency increased by 16-fold, and the price level increased by 75-fold within the year of 1922. And this is nothing compared with what happened in the following months. And again, thinking of inflation as hyperinflation as a situation where the price level is literally increasing by 50% or 100% every month, you can see that this was definitely realized in the year 1923. And the inflation rate that you can derive from that is shown to the right. Okay, and towards the end, the price level is rising so fast that the money has no value in terms of purchasing power. It has value as heating fuel, or fuel for a fireplace, or to make toys, or building blocks. Or one of the interesting aspects of hyperinflation is that in the postal system, the stamps are no longer actually printed with a value. They're actually stamped in the moment that the stamps are bought. This turns out to be a very economical way of doing business, but it's a bit tricky because of the potential for counterfeiting is increased. And again, in German, a billion is a trillion, so we're talking about 10 to the 12th power. The situation that we saw in many other hyperinflation episodes in the 20th century. Now you can see the pictures are quite suggestive. People carrying their paychecks home in a wheelbarrow, central bankers pushing huge stacks of money around. It sounds a bit absurd. The question is, how do you get to that? And you can get to it the same way that Zimbabwe got to it in the 2000 decade leading up to 2008, or the hyperinflation in Germany, the years leading up to 1922, namely a very large pressure point placed on the central bank to create money, to make loans to the central government to pay their bills, and these loans have to be, of course, put on the balance sheet of the central bank, and the central bank has as liabilities the paper that it sort of prints to represent or to pay out the loans that it's making to the central government. So in Weimar Germany, this was a desperate measure given the strikes in the Ruhr and the Saarland, basically to pay the workers in state enterprises because tax revenues were falling. In Zimbabwe, it was a similar situation when the Zimbabwean government nationalized many farms and didn't provide for an adequate adjustment of production. There was a large shortfall in revenues for the government, and the government needing to pay its army, to pay its police, to pay its other functionaries had to resort to printing money in a big way. And again, the situation is quite dramatic. Now, Philip Cagan is generally considered to be one of the most interesting analysts of this phenomenon. He wrote a very important dissertation on the subject at the University of Chicago with Milton Friedman as his advisor. He was also a professor at Brown and then Columbia University. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors. And his work, simply writing down the price level and the money supply evolution for many interesting countries and episodes, and proposing a framework to think about that was a real contribution. His dissertation, a part of his dissertation appeared in an important book that Milton Friedman wrote in the 1950s, trying to reassert the notion of monetary, the importance of monetary aggregates in understanding the long-term evolution of the price level. And remember, we're always talking about the long term. In the short term, many other things will happen. We'll see later on in this course. But at that time, analysts had really spent too much energy focusing on the short run and not enough thinking about the long run, namely, what is the consequence of excessive monetary growth for the price level in the long run? And we know that if there's a thin hope for monetary neutrality, it implies that central banks that create money at an excessive rate will not be able to avoid the consequences in the long run, although it may take a while for that to happen. So this is a definitive work. It's on the reading list. So if we think about the Sadrowski model, we can basically understand the following. One of the first order conditions was that the agent, the representative agent, holds real money to the extent that the marginal utility of holding that money is equal to the opportunity costs of doing so, which would be the nominal interest rate. And the nominal interest rate is the real interest rate plus the rate of growth in the price level. And the real interest rate in the Kagan model turned out to be the subjective rate of time preference, the stripped down version that we looked at. Kagan in his original paper, and Sadrowski in his original paper looked at capital, so it would be the marginal product of capital instead. If you substitute into the first order condition that we had in the Sadrowski model, we end up getting the condition that the marginal product of holding real balances is equal to that opportunity cost that I just said. And if you substitute our assumed isoelastic formula for the subutility of agents over real balances, the first derivative of that function is equal to m raised to the minus gamma. And gamma is a positive parameter, so you can see that immediately we have an invertible function and an implied demand for real balances. So real balances will be a negative function of the sum of the subjective discount rate of our household in the Sadrowski model plus the inflation rate that the household is facing. Now again, this is a model with perfect foresight, so the agent knows what the inflation rate is going to be, and therefore the higher the sum of those two is, the lower the agent will choose to hold his wealth or her wealth in real balances. We say that this is a very robust result. This is well known and has been empirically verified in many countries and around the world that the demand for cash and bank accounts, i.e. forms of holding wealth that involve a sacrifice of a nominal interest rate, responds negatively to that nominal interest rate, and therefore it responds negatively to both impatience and inflation. Okay? Now if you take logarithms of both sides, we have something that looks like an elasticity of money demand. Actually, some people call this the semi-elasticity. It's not quite correct, but it's often referred to as the elasticity of money demand. 1% change in those right-hand side variables lead to an eta% reduction in real holdings of money, which means given the price level, you would reduce your nominal holdings, or given your nominal holdings, an increase in the price level would accomplish the same outcome. Now, if you convert that model to the discrete time, we'll have the inflation rate measured now as tomorrow's price level divided by today's price level minus 1, and that's the inflation rate without the percentage formulation. So it'd be, if you want to make that in percentage terms, you'd have to multiply it by 100. But that would imply something like the nominal rate of interest on the right-hand side is an argument to that same function. And if you take logs of that, we can approximate it. And again, this is an approximation that is used frequently in monetary economics. We end up getting the logarithm of the real money supply on the right-hand side. You can see that it's the difference between the logarithm of the money supply in nominal terms minus the log of the price level. That is a negative function of the change in the logarithm of the price level that is expected between today and the next period. So today's money demand depends on tomorrow's price level relative to today's price level. So that's the role of future expectations in a current demand for money. This is called the Kagan money demand equation. So you can derive it in many different ways. We saw how it arises naturally from the Sadrowski model, but it could also be James Tobin and William Baumol were able to derive something like that from an inventory, transactions, demand for money type of theory. But here we're using the Sadrowski model as the motivator. So utility over real balances, even though it involves a sacrifice, involves a negative demand for money, and the negative a positive demand for money that depends negatively on the inflation rate that's expected to occur over the future. Okay, so you can see that this is an interesting possible theory for the price level today. If you go back and ask the question, what is determined today? Well, the central bank supposedly determines the money supply today. And the price level tomorrow is determined by expectations of the price level tomorrow. So all that's left to move is the price level today. So we can actually think of this as a determination of the price level today. And that's what Kagan and other people who have studied hyperinflations have come to believe and come to argue, that expectations of the future determine the present price level. Okay, and to see that, we just need to rearrange that equation, solve for the price level today in logarithms as a function of today's money supply, which is presumably determined by the central bank. And this is, again, a presumption that means the central bank would, if it wanted, could actually control the aggregate supply of bank liabilities that are held by the public. This is a question that always arises in a hyperinflation. Banks, bank deposits tend to drop dramatically, if not go to zero, because people are running around paying in cash, because banks already take a couple of days to do the transaction. So it doesn't seem like much of a good business model for banks. It's not a good business model for banks to be doing, because they won't get any customers. Customers can't wait 2 or 3 days to make a bank transfer. So people tend to go into cash or to highly fungible liquid means of payment. So today's price level depends on today's money supply, determined by the central bank, plus the expectation of the future price level. And Kagan basically said this could be the basis for a more elaborate way of thinking about the price level today if you just lead this equation by one period. Again, this is a world, in this particular case, of perfect foresight. Tomorrow's price level is going to depend on tomorrow's money supply plus the next day's expected price level. Okay, so we have a recursive situation in which we can take the latter equation and substitute it in the former, and we see that the price level today is dependent on two money supplies, one today and one tomorrow, and the price level on the day after tomorrow. Okay, but there's no reason to stop there. You can do this ad infinitum, and you can end up writing the price level today as as a sum of money supplies from 0 to capital T, appropriately weighted by a term that is the elasticity of money demand divided by the elasticity of money demand plus 1. So it's like a discount factor. It functions like a discount factor because it means that this geometric average, the weights are declining geometrically as the power of time. And then you've got this leading term, which is the price level in T plus cap T plus 1. Okay, so I think this is the tail that wags the dog, if you like. It's the last term of the price after you've accounted for all the intervening logarithms of future money supply. Now, if you let cap T go to infinity, you end up having two terms. You have one is an infinite weighted sum of future expected money supplies and current money supply, of course, and then you have this leading term, which is a single term, and we don't really know what's going to happen. It could, in some sense, the price level could grow faster than 1 plus eta divided by eta, or 1 over eta, and that would imply a second term that's actually infinite, and that would kind of mean the price level today is infinite, which means that the money is worthless today. This is often called a bubble component because it implies that this price level keeps rising at some rate that doesn't have any sort of moorings. It's just rising on its own. If we don't think this is a tenable situation or a sustainable situation in the long run, we'd basically assert that at some point that bubble will probably burst. And if it does, then you have a zero value for that term, and therefore you can really focus on the intervening future money supplies as of period T. Okay, so the lesson of the Kagan model is not the current money supply, but future expected future money supplies matter. And that's a very important insight, because if you return to that and think about it, it means that the anticipation of future monetary policy will impact the current price level. And if a central bank can credibly argue that the money supply will not grow at a higher rate, and remember, first differences of the log of money supply are the monetary growth rate. So convincing the public that the central bank is serious when it talks about controlling monetary growth would be one way of getting the price level under control in period T. Now, this whole goes through in a world of uncertainty. The interesting thing about this is we've assumed that agents have perfect knowledge of the future evolution of the price level. That's nonsense, but it's a good way to fix ideas because it shows the importance of the expectations. But if we had a world of uncertainty, it's pretty feasible it's pretty plausible that households would try to avoid the mistakes, especially those involved with a high rate of inflation, by making a lousy forecast. So they'll try to do as best they can, and they won't be consistently fooled. This is often thought of as a form of the rational expectations hypothesis. One version is a strong version, The strongest version is that agents actually have access to our model, and a weaker version would be that agents just don't make systematic mistakes. They don't consistently underestimate the price level, and therefore if they make a mistake in this period, they're going to try to avoid it in the future periods, and they may even try to reassert the real terms of trade that they had before the surprise took place. So the way of formulating this, as I said, takes various guises, and one way to do it is just to say that it's just the conditional expectation of agents given their available information. This is called the strong or stronger form of rational expectations, and we would think of the ET as being the expectations operator, a linear operator in the sense of probability theory based on the model. Okay, so the model is the data generating function for the price level, and the price level is a random variable. And in that case, the model basically goes through. The model is log linear, so all the operations that I performed on the certainty version of the model apply when the model involves uncertainty, because in this log linear form, the expected value of the price level tomorrow is going to be a linear function of the logarithm of the price level in the next period and the log of the money supply today. So the same recursion can be applied, and the price level today is equal to the conditionally expected weighted average of future logarithms of money supply and current money supply plus some leading term that we called the bubble, or the non-fundamental solution. Most important insight of this, whether in a world of certainty or uncertainty, is that the current price level, which I say price is the price of all goods, adjust immediately to clear the market. Supply, demand, and money are equal. And this is very similar to the Samuelson model that we had in the overlapping generation sense, where the generation was a 25-year period, or a 20-year period, or a 30-year period. Okay, so again, the insight of Kagan is to understand a picture like this, which is why did the price level of Bulgaria, first, why did it spike the way it did? And that's easy to understand if you understand that Bulgaria had a planned economy and released a few prices along the way until the mid-1990s, but it was in the middle of a transition from a socialist planned economy to a market economy. But more importantly, it was funding its budget deficits, which were rising rapidly, by accessing central bank credit. And the central bank credit was paid out in the form of banknotes, because the Bulgarian banking system was fairly primitive at the time. And you can see that at the time, the price level was already starting to adjust, even though the inflation rate was rather low. And you see this also in the fact that Bulgarians were reducing their real holdings of money. So M over P, the orange line, already started dropping rapidly, precipitously, if you like, even before the spike of the inflation. So in some sense, people in Bulgaria were already reducing their money holdings because they were anticipating that at some point the price level would rise and they would be exposed to a very large increase in the price level. In my own trips to Bulgaria, I noticed, and I was actually there around 1994, I noticed that a lot of the shelves were empty, and I know the Bulgarian economy was producing goods and services, they just weren't producing them to be sold in stores, and people were holding back with some perhaps anticipation that prices would go up, or people were buying the goods and hoarding them. So this is two sort of symptoms of a high inflation episode. But most importantly, the spike of the price level occurred very quickly, and then the Bulgarian government reformed the central bank and reformed monetary policy. They actually went on a sort of currency board with the Deutsche Mark at the time, which meant that to the extent that Bulgaria could actually maintain this currency board, which means that if you had leva, you could go to the central bank and get Deutsche Marks at a fixed exchange rate. Having a fixed exchange rate is like having a peg to external value of your currency, and that, of course, can get expectations of inflation down to the extent that people believe that the monetary policy of Bulgaria will follow that rigorous course. And in fact, you see after the reforms, the real money supply, the real money demand, which is equal to money supply in this model, started rising immediately after inflation peaked and declined dramatically. Okay, so we still have to ask the question, are these people, are they really rational? Are they really believing in evolutions that are on average correct, or do they make systematic errors? And the evidence is we see similar patterns in many countries. Recently in Turkey in 2019, you see a similar evolution of the price level, an accelerating evolution of the price level, increasing inflation, and a reduction in demand for money, and a reduction in the real measured demand for money. So the model has a certain amount of predictive power. The question still remains, why would the central bank do this? The central bank is not by nature out to print lots of money. That's a very expensive operation. During most severe hyperinflations, one of the big items in the balance of payments, or the balance of trade that is in deficit, is the import, that contributes to the deficit, is the import of the paper that's been printed by usually Swiss or German companies of the banknotes, as ludicrous as that seems. So the central bank seems unlikely to do that on its own. Usually it has to be sort of coerced to do it because the government needs the funding, and the central bank can deliver the funding because it has the monopoly rights to create the means of payment. So, there are two possibilities. One possibility, the central bank says, no, we're not going to do that. You might say that after the Reichsbank was reformed and became the Rentenbank in 1924, that they committed to a very strict monetary policy and they were forbidden to lend to the government. This would be a case of where the central bank can say no to the government, and just like the European Central Bank could say no to buying securities on the open market, we call this central bank dominance. It's only one possibility, but it could be the case that the central bank can say no, and if the fiscal authority has a deficit, it has to go to the capital markets and raise money by issuing bonds. The central bank has no commitment to buy those bonds, and therefore the borrowing capacity of the central fiscal authority is limited. In that case, the price level becomes a function of expected future money supply as decided by the monetary policy authority. But it can well be the case, as I say in the last line, that the central bank is not independent. The central bank might be coerced into printing money, funding the central government's deficits. Okay? Suppose that the central bank is not dominant. And again, because I say this is not an accident that we have these hyperinflations, it seems like the government has been somehow forcing the central bank to do its business. And I told you already, Napoleon founded the Banque de France, and Adolf Hitler tried to take over the Reichsbank because it's a great way to finance adventurous wars, and it's not an accident that these types of situations often lead to high inflation or hyperinflation. So fiscal dominance is the alternative to monetary dominance. That would mean that basically the fiscal authority imposes will on the monetary authority, and the people understand that, and they see future deficits, and the price level would react commensurately. This is a situation that we would have in high inflation environments, not in something we observe today. At least that's the current thinking. So to summarize, the underlying problem is central bank finance of government budget deficits. Hyperinflation usually arises for that reason, and fiscal deficits can be related to wars. They can be related to real terms of trade change. I think if it can also be related to government-caused disasters. If you think about the the problems of Zimbabwe. They were really homegrown. The nationalization of the farms was a big mistake in an economic sense, even though it might have appealed to some people's sense of social justice. It meant that Zimbabwe lost a very important source of its real economic well-being, and because it couldn't replace it, the central bank was forced by the government of Zimbabwe to print tons of money to pay civil servants and finance a very large budget deficit. Things get worse if inflation rises suddenly and the taxpayers try very hard to avoid paying their taxes. In doing so, they actually increase the deficit because the revenues of the government fall. And this is called the Tanzi effect, meaning that high inflation and rising inflation can lead to larger deficits, which lead in turn to larger increases in the money supply to finance the growing government deficit. So in a sense, both of these might be endogenously and simultaneously determined. And a good example of this was Bolivia in the early 1980s. This is a while ago, but Bolivia was an extremely successful, growing country in the 1970s because the price of copper was rising, the price of oil was rising, the price of tin was rising, and the government ran the state-owned enterprises, and they made lots of money. And then what happened in the early 1980s was the price of copper and the price of zinc and the price of tin and the price of oil all started to fall in real terms. And this meant that Bolivia's sort of business model was collapsing. And we see a very sharp rise in the inflation rate in Bolivia. And I think you can call Bolivia hyperinflation after 1982 or maybe even 1981. This is the rate of change percent per annum in the price deflator, the GDP deflator, the Pasha index for the price level measured on GDP in Bolivia, and this is an annual rate of change. So these are really extreme changes, and you can see that you can anticipate this, that already in 1981 the government's deficit increased immensely. The government surplus with a minus sign in front of it is the deficit. So as of 1981, the deficit rose to ultimately almost half of GDP because the collapse of the government enterprises meant they had huge deficits, and the government these workers in the copper mines and the tin mines were basically paid by the central bank. And commensurately, M2, which is a measure of monetary aggregates, including checking accounts and savings accounts, rose very sharply. And you can see that at these high rates of inflation, the Kagan model is a pretty good predictor of what's going on. At the same time, GDP was already was not growing anymore by 1980, and it was actually shrinking because of this collapse of the relative prices of these primary commodities that Bolivia had actually done quite well with in the 1970s, and it just shows up immediately in this gaping government funding deficit, which the government basically could not issue bonds. Who's going to hold a Bolivian bond with a government that's not credible? So the central bank took over and printed money. So to summarize, fiscal deficits are a prime candidate, not a misbehaving central bank. Central banks don't get any utility from printing lots of money. It's usually coming from pressure from the central government. And we see this again and again. We see it in Argentina. We see it in Turkey. In burgeoning inflation situations, you always look to the government as a cause. There may be some other things that can happen. Sometimes a government may try to maintain an exchange rate, and the central bank may be instructed to buy lots of foreign currency, and in doing so it expands its balance sheet, and for some time could also have a inflationary impact. This is a rather rare situation, but it could also be a cause of high inflation, but governments usually don't do that for fun. Usually there's a reason for maintaining the exchange rate. It may have to do with trying to avoid the political consequences of an appreciating exchange rate. But as we saw in the case of China, China actually monetized, or the Chinese central bank bought a lot of dollars in the years between 1990 and 2010. And because the economy of China was growing so fast, this did not translate into any sort of significant rise of inflation. Okay, so where does this take us? This takes us now to the transition to the rest of the course, because we've talked about the long run. We're also interested in the shorter run. We're interested in fluctuations. And we're interested not just in the steady state, which has driven a lot of our analysis, but we're also interested in the dynamics. So starting next year, we'll speak of we'll speak more about, or talk more about cycles as opposed to long-term trends, and we'll talk about the dynamic interaction of inflation and output. But we already have the tools to talk about that, so we'll be in pretty good shape. I'll give you a graphical tool to work with, and then we'll talk about how to make sense of the graph, make sense of the curves in the graph, so you'll have something to hang on to for a quick answer, and you'll have something to chew on to understand why the curves shift or why they have certain slopes. To get to an understanding of inflation, one has to understand where it came from, and I think the recent experience is instructive. In the United States and Germany over the past 40 years, inflation has been rather low, actually, coming off the 1980s. But recently we've had a rise in inflation. If you go back another 20 years, you see that inflation also rose for a period of time. It's always instructive to think about where this came from. Ultimately, in this course, we'll develop some theories about why firms set prices that can lead to higher prices in the future as a short-run reaction to situation at the present. But the most important thing I'd like to talk about now is how expectations matter and how they adjust, which is motivating why we have thought so much about inflation, because inflation is a little bit like an oil tanker. It takes a little bit of time to get going, but once it gets moving, it has quite a bit of inertia. It's hard to change. These are just kind of insights that people have acquired over the past 100 years. So the first time we ever encountered inflation was the demise in the modern industrial world, was the demise of Bretton Woods in 1971. Okay, and up until then, we'd had some situations where inflation would be relatively high, but not really high, or it's been very, very low or even negative. And just by observation, we were able to see that certain variables move in certain ways with the inflation rate. When inflation is high, other variables may be high, other variables may be low. Again, this is what we call inductive reasoning. I mean, we have some observations on reality, and we'd like to make some sense of them. Think of Kepler and the planets. That was my example I gave earlier. So A.W. Phillips looked at data on nominal wages, wages in pounds sterling, in a period when the price level in England or the United Kingdom was relatively stable. Okay, and he discovered that in periods when inflation measured as the rate of change of nominal wages was high, the rate of unemployment was relatively low, and vice versa. This is not a perfect relationship, but it looked pretty good from where he was sitting. He saw this sort of as an observation, and it kind of made sense to him that in periods when the labor market's tight, workers have a pretty good situation where they're free to change their job, negotiate better wage deals with their bosses, and inflation measured as a change of wages, not prices, but the rate of change of nominal wages would be stronger or be higher. Similarly, when unemployment is high, as Karl Marx noted, it's easy to pick up cheap labor, and workers have less bargaining power, so the rate of growth of wages in nominal terms should be lower. Okay, so remember, wages are a part of the economy's cost structure. Taken as a whole, it's about 2/3 of the economy's value added. So a change in the wages for the whole economy, for the macroeconomy, is an important source of pressure for the prices, for the evolution of prices in the economy. And that's why one would suspect that a good theory of wage inflation is a pretty good theory of price inflation. Okay, so A.W. Phillips, this guy, basically a fascinating fellow, sheep farmer, ran his own cinema for a while, crocodile hunter, went to study engineering in the UK, and in the way, it was a very tough time to be a young man at the time. He was conscripted to fight in World War II and was a prisoner in the Japanese POW camp for about 3.5 years. During that period, he developed a certain affinity for economics, and eventually, after doing his degree, he went on to study economics and wrote some interesting papers. He also became a member of the Order of the British Empire, which is a fairly respectable thing. I think Mick Jagger has that, but not everybody. His most important discovery was this relationship. It's not the only thing he did, but he kind of discovered this relationship. A lot of people would claim that Irving Fisher also discovered it in the United States in the 1930s. There's a nice paper where he says he claims the same thing for the U.S. data. And these are both in periods when unemployment traversed quite a range of values, and the inflation rate was rather low, but still fairly volatile and variable. And it made sense for him to look at wage inflation. And the Phillips, one of the other things he did was develop this machine, which is a hydraulic machine based on the national income and product account. So based on Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus Z can be thought of as it's an identity, of course, but if you think about the causal relationships that we can imagine to assign to C and I and G, you can think of this as a system of equations, and that's what we do in macro. But you can also think of this as a system of pipes connecting various levels of water in a hydraulic system. And being an engineer, Phillips was sort of pretty obsessed with this idea and was able to put it into a machine, which you can find in many museums around the world. And I've seen this. I saw this at the LSE when I was visiting there, and it was in a back room. Actually, now it's in the Science Museum in London. There's a version. There are several versions in the United States. There's one in New Zealand. And Phillips basically showed that it's an analog computer. Effectively, it was able to track the evolution of the components of GDP just on the basis of fluid mechanics. So it's a kind of a cool idea, and it was even described in some of the press reports at the time. But this is what I want to talk about. This was Phillips' contribution to our field. Phillips basically said that we've got this negative relationship between a nominal rate of change, the rate of change of wages in percent per annum, okay, and unemployment in the UK economy. And he took a period when the British currency was not freely issued like it was in the post-Bretton Woods, the post-1971 period. This is a period when inflation got as high as maybe 9%, and sometimes it was negative. And this is because the UK was pretty much on a gold standard, which meant that the supply of gold determined roughly the amount of transactions medium in the economy. This is not exactly the case because the Bank of England cheated a little bit, but they couldn't cheat systematically in the sense of creating new credit and new money every period in increasing amounts. So that was just not allowed back then. And still in all, Phillips finds a negative relationship, and it's kind of a log linear relationship. He described it as such in his famous paper in 1958, Economica. Okay, so naturally, if you look at this, you see, wow, this must be something there. I mean, the tight labor markets, inflation is rising in nominal terms, which kind of violates all your predisposed notions of money neutrality. Why should the unemployment rate in any way depend on the rate of change of a nominal variable in pounds? Well, if you think that pounds aren't being created in ever-increasing amounts, maybe there's something real going on there, but it must be anchored by people's expectations of inflation. So already Phillips was thinking maybe in these terms, but he didn't write down that model. But he certainly said we shouldn't use this as a basis for policy. If you read the paper, he's actually a bit circumspect. But the negative relationship is definitely there. Okay, so in tight labor markets, wages are rising fast. And when unemployment's really high and depressed economies, wages might even be falling. And there's some deviations, of course. Okay, so a lot of economists at the time thought this was the magic bullet that would help us connect the real economy that we've studied in the first half of the course with the business cycles in the second. Namely, all we can imagine is, you can accept higher rates of inflation, you just have to accept them. Higher rates of inflation means low unemployment. Yay, unemployment's low, good for the economy. And if we want, we can elect some Republicans and we can slide back down to the 1959 point if we want. That was the conception of the profession in the 1960s. So there's a fair amount of optimism that we can actually sort of master this animal. And in 1959, Dwight Eisenhower was president, Republican, fairly conservative, a general, did a great job of building the highways in the United States, but he also believed that government should be strict and should run surpluses when possible. You shouldn't have deficit spending. So it was kind of a political thing, and unemployment was high. And then Kennedy got elected, and he cut taxes and did a lot of military spending, and a lot of social programs were initiated by him and were followed up by his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And as a result, the movement from the 1959 point to the 1969 point is simply a huge expansion of the U.S. economy, the Vietnam War, the Great Society, and a lot of spending beyond your means. In 1969, Richard Nixon was elected, and Richard Nixon promised lower inflation because inflation was high, like it is in the United States now. And Richard Nixon promised that he would do whatever it took to get inflation down again. And his notion was, all we have to do is cut back on government spending, increase taxes, and everything would just slide down the Phillips slope, and we'd be back to where we started again. Okay? So this notion of a trade-off was criticized a lot at the time, although it was politically expedient for the Democrats who were in power in the 1960s. So it was a good time for the United States. Economic growth had never been higher. People were buying lots of cars, and 2 cars in every garage, and 2 chickens in every pot. It was a great time. And this seemed to be like a vindication for Keynes, because Keynes basically said all we have to do is put our foot on the accelerator, increase spending, cut taxes, and we can move the economy to a higher sort of higher level of economic activity and welfare. And at the same time, we'll have to accept a bit of higher inflation, but that's kind of euthanasia for the people who have lots of money. They can suffer a little bit of loss of purchasing power. That was the logic that Keynes was pushing. Now, at the same time, this criticism was coming from not necessarily the right wing, but just coming from a class of economists who thought that the money supply was being ignored in this analysis, and the monetary fundamentals of inflation were being ignored so much that eventually inflation would come back and bite us in the rear end. That was the notion that Milton Friedman said. He said this monetary nature of inflation will come back and get its revenge at some point in the future. And he made a very controversial address to the American Economic Association in 1967. He said basically this. He said, there is a temporary but not a permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And there's no such thing as a permanent trade-off. So the notion of riding down the Phillips curve or riding up the Phillips curve, as Kennedy and Johnson did in the 1960s in the United States, and other countries, by the way, also. I think Helmut Schmidt famously said he would rather have 4% inflation than 4% unemployment. That's a long time ago, but that type of thinking, connecting a nominal variable with a real variable, seemed to Milton Friedman to be a rather dangerous thing. And Milton Friedman, in his famous address in 1967, which was published in 1968, he said it was the unanticipated part of inflation that was mattering, not the inflation itself. So getting inflation up to 6% may look like you're doing it to purchase lower unemployment, but in the long run, there's no reason to believe that the rate of unemployment, a real variable, would have anything to do with the rate of inflation, the rate of which Milton Friedman thought was, in the long run, correlated with the rate of growth of the monetary aggregate. Okay? And he went on to argue that basically the unemployment rate is the outcome of real variables. He called it the general equilibrium, involving the characteristics of demand and supply for labor, the demand for commodities that are complements or substitutes, market imperfections, shocks, variability in supply and demand, the costs of gathering information for the unemployed people and for firms to find workers, the costs of mobility, et cetera. So when this was published, Milton Friedman was criticized roundly as being some sort of fearmonger, and we should just ignore him. And it turns out that Milton Friedman was completely right. So in 1969, Richard Nixon was elected president, and he said, okay, my fellow Americans, I'm going to increase the tax surcharge, I'm going to cut spending, we're going to get out of Vietnam. All these sort of ideas would reduce the government's claim on GDP and therefore reduce aggregate demand. We'll see later next year where that would, we could actually think of how that would matter. And therefore, we would just slide right down the Phillips slope and we'd move back to the Eisenhower years of the 1950s. Well, he tried that and it didn't work. In fact, another bunch of other things happened that caused the Phillips curve to basically collapse in the form that people thought in the 1960s that it existed. And you can see that there's definitely still a negative correlation between changes in unemployment and changes in inflation. But the level of that relationship had shifted. And it shifted fairly persistently for the next decade until several years of a deep recession. And if you go back and plot the same data for the United States today, it looks surprisingly like the old Phillips curve of the 1960s. But it gives us the warning that maybe a shift of some of the determinants of the Phillips curve that we hadn't thought about could be absolutely relevant for understanding how it works. So that's the point of the second half of the course, is understanding why that Phillips curve shifted and why it shifted back, and how a similar experience can be observed in other industrial countries of Europe and Asia. And one of the most important things is that indeed the real economy is independent of the evolution of inflation in the long run. So it's kind of a vindication of Friedman's critique, that indeed there is kind of a slow-moving, long-run equilibrium of the labor market and of other markets. And what we're observing is basically people moving along some relationship in which firms are willing to produce at higher rates of inflation and workers are willing to work at higher inflation rates, wage and price inflation rates, but not consistent with the long run. Okay, so we'll use this as a foundation for macrodynamics in general. Expectations are a key element of macroeconomic fluctuations, we'll see. I mean, not only is just in the context of the Ramsey model, we saw that expectations of the long-term future are important, but here, short-term changes of expectations can matter as well. Keynes emphasized this when he talked about animal spirits, the collapse, the systematic collapse of investment because Entrepreneurs get pessimistic about the future. Habeler, Schumpeter, Fisher, all these guys talked about the role of expectations in the future. And these may not be rational, but in our course and in our thinking, we try to ground our own thinking by saying, well, let's just assume that agents are as smart as we are and they can figure this out. And if they can, then it's important to use the theory to think about how expectations are formed. Just in terms of the OLG model, we can get some idea of how this works. So I'll make an important modification in that agents, when they're young, don't have a fixed endowment of the consumption good that they sell to the old people, but rather they have to work. And working means they have to supply their labor, and their labor is compensated at some wage rate, and this wage rate is nominal, so it's in terms of the money that they will use when they're older, and the price at which they purchase consumption today is also in terms of money. So money serves this function of facilitating exchange, and it also is a common denominator for measuring value of labor and the value of goods today and the goods tomorrow. Okay, so we'll just make this very simple modification to the OLG model and see how far it gets us. Okay, so agents still live 2 periods. When they're young, they supply labor. That's painful, but it enables them to buy consumption goods today with money that they acquire, but also tomorrow with money that they will save into the second period and be subject to the possibility that the price of money in terms of goods changes. The price of goods in terms of money changes. Okay, so when agents are young, they work, and work is painful. Work creates disutility. Okay, so disutility will just subtract utility of consumption. From utility of consumption, will subtract the disutility of work. Working has this slight advantage, the essential advantage if you're an agent. If you don't work, you can't consume either today or tomorrow, so you're going to do some work. Okay, and you earn WT for every unit of L you work. And, there should be a subscript on the L. And every period, the agent, every period, young people are working for paper money at nominal wage WT, and they can buy real goods CT at price level PT. Okay. Now, what happens when you're old? You have some money you've saved to transact in the future, and this money is subject to the possibility that inflation goes up. Okay, so if you spend your money today, you know exactly what the price level is today in this model, and you're subject to only the risk that prices will rise in the future. And if it's a certainty model, you know exactly what price is going to be, but they may be higher, and therefore you may not be so interested in working tomorrow. And the reason is that the government is injecting new cash into the economy. So unlike the last version of the OLG model, we had a fixed supply of money. Now we have a money that's growing at a rate mu, which means that people who have money when they're old will get like an extra transfer proportional to their cash holdings. And we'll call that mu, T plus 1. That's the rate of growth of money between T and T plus 1. So the households now choose their consumption when young, consumption when old, their labor supply when young, and the cash holdings that they will acquire, i.e. not spend on consumption today, to allow them to consume tomorrow. So the money is purely a vehicle for savings, as in the Samuelson model. It's not used, strictly speaking, for transactions today. In this model, it's used for transactions tomorrow. So the households maximize this object utility net of the disutility of work, and subject to a budget constraint, which we can easily write down as just 2 different equations that we can combine into one by eliminating MD, because money is really only used to facilitate transactions in the second period. And we'll assume specialized forms of the utility function. CT C1 T is a typo, so just eliminate that from the slide. And this is just a generalized form of the utility function. And gamma and nu are assumed to be non-negative. If they take the value 0, then it's a linear form, and if we're close to 1, then we have the isoelastic form that's logarithmic. So in general, this is called the isoelastic specification for utility, because if you take the elasticity, gamma and mu are respectively the elasticities of utility with respect to the arguments, C and L. But as you can see, when gamma or mu get close to 1, these functions get very, very large. At the same time, they get large with a limit. So they don't go to infinity, but you can't just plug in gamma equals 1 because you'd be dividing by 0, or nu equals 1. So if you let the respective parameters go to 1, you can apply L'Hopital's rule, and you end up getting that these are the logarithmic functions. So that's kind of a fun idea. Logarithmic function is very popular, as you've already seen with Leopold in his section. So households need to work. How much should they work? Well, utility is more general than the log, so we're not going to have the logarithmic magic. Remember, the logarithmic function has the property, when it's defines utility over consumption, that the proportions of your budget spent on various elements are constant. That turns out to be a very robust and problematic feature, because we notice that budget shares are not constant, so utility is probably not logarithmic. But in any case, this is going to give us a bit of response, higher or lower elasticity of substitution than 1. Okay, so define the elasticity of intertemporal substitution as being the inverse of gamma. Okay, so this is following the notation in some famous textbooks. And therefore, sigma is going to range between 0 and infinity. If it's equal to 0, then you have something like a Leontief preferences over consumption over time. And in the special case of gamma going to 1, we have logarithmic utility. Okay? So this theory will imply that cash in advance money demand can be sensitive to the rate of return on money. We already showed that earlier. Okay, and if we substitute into the problem and look at the maximization problem, we can actually get first order conditions that are relatively intuitive. Okay, so by substituting, we eliminate C1. So basically, we're choosing C2, our old consumption, and our labor supply today. And that will implicitly, through the budget constraint, imply how much I can consume today. So we just, instead of using a Lagrange approach, we can just eliminate consumption today. Okay, so we have the case of, we'll consider the case of certainty. So people know for sure money growth in the future, and they know inflation. This just focuses ideas. The most interesting part of this model is allowing all these things to be uncertain. The first order conditions, when you substitute for C1 back in, even though you've eliminated in the maximization problem, you end up getting that C2 is a function of C1, they're related, and that relationship is going to depend on the elasticity of substitution 1 over gamma, and that's going to depend in turn on the path of the rate of increment of the money supply relative to the inflation rate. So it's like a real return on holding money with the real return coming from the government paying you more money based on what you had to start with. Labor supply is going to be related to C1, and you can see this is a complex relationship, so it's really not, you can't really say anything yet because you have to substitute, but labor supply today will be correlated with, in an inverse way, with wages today relative to C1, depending on what C1 is. Now, we haven't solved for C1, so to do that, we have to combine it with the budget constraint, and then we'll have 3 results. We'll have a labor supply choice, we'll have a consumption in the first period, and we'll have consumption in the second period, and all these are hanging together, or sort of moving together in some way that's governed by these first order conditions and the budget constraints. So that's the important thing. You can't say anything more about this until you've solved for the level of C1, C2, and L as a function of the exogenous variables on the right-hand side. And that's why we do this exercise. So getting there is a little bit of exercise. So you can take ratios and eliminate C1 again and express C2 in terms of labor supply today. Okay, so you see those are kind of, ceteris paribus will be positively related because both nu and gamma are positive. Okay, so think of you know, if you're going to have more consumption tomorrow and today, it better be worth it. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about it. If you substitute for C1, you end up getting the first order condition for L in terms of C2, and then you can substitute for C2, and then we can eliminate both levels of consumption from this equation. Now we can actually solve for labor supply in the first period of life. Okay, and you'll see that it does depend on only things that are exogenous to from the agent's perspective, the real wage, the inflation rate, and the rate of growth of the money supply from the perspective of period T. So a little bit of algebra, which I'm going to show you on the slides. You can actually eliminate, or you can solve for L as a function of all these things. And a bit of simplification. You already see that we've got L now as a function of the real wage, function of money growth, and of price growth. And if we express it in terms of the elasticity of substitution, we see that labor supply in the first period depends on the inflation rate that's expected, it depends on the money growth rate that's expected, and it also depends on the real wage today. Okay, and if those objects are known with certainty, then we can say with certain the impact on current labor supply. It might be the case, of course, that agents have to form expectations. So if you take the logarithms of this expression and take approximations of that, you could show that the labor supply today will depend on the expected rate of inflation in the future, and it depends on the expected, if the price level today can't be observed, it depends on the expected price level today. That's the Lucas Island model. And it also depends essentially on the sign of the exponent on the real wage, which is going to be related to the elasticity of substitution, intertemporal substitution, as well as the disutility of labor in the utility function. And you can see that as long as sigma times nu is less than 1, we'll have and sigma is greater than 1, we'll have a positive response of labor supply today to the real wage, which is kind of what we'd expect, but you can see that it's complicated because if agents have a lot of disutility of supplying labor, if nu takes a large value, that could actually flip the sign of this relationship. Okay, so using that, we can actually derive the other two. We can derive consumption in terms of the real wage, and we can derive, and labor supply, and we can derive consumption tomorrow as a function of the real wage and labor supply, and then we're done. So basically we see that current wages, current consumption depends on present and past real wages. It depends on current and future inflation and real monetary growth. So all these things jointly determined can determine the path of those variables. So even in the world of overlapping generations, we have potential for fluctuations. And think about if we reduce the period to a quarter, then suddenly you have much more room for action. So in a world of certainty or of perfect foresight, you may not have regrets, but in reality you do have regrets, you have uncertainty. So mistakes are part of the story of generating the cycle. And in Lucas's Island model, oversupply of labor, misperception of the price level is a key explanation of the Phillips curve even. So in periods when unemployment is low, agents have underestimated the price level and worked too hard for a real wage that they perceived to be high, but wasn't high at all. Yeah, so you don't know what's going to happen with the money supply in this model. You don't know what's going to happen with the future interest rates or the future transfer policy of the government. You don't know what inflation is going to be. You don't even know what the real wage is going to be. All these things are possible sources of uncertainty that can affect the behavior of the economy in the short run. Okay, so that's going to be the basis for understanding the short run behavior of the macroeconomy, and you subject that economy to shifts in demand and supply. This will be a source of expectational mistakes, which could be thought of as one of the prime determinants of the business cycle. Okay, so just to summarize, macroeconomics in the long run, we're interested in the steady state, we're interested in the long-term trends. In the short run, we're interested in dynamics. So we'll spend the rest of the semester talking about dynamic interaction of inflation and output. And we'll have to understand how shocks, disturbances that surprise us, can lead to undersupply or oversupply or deficient demand or excessive demand for goods and services. In the beginning, you know, the Keynesian approach was to take a very sort of naive view of people's expectations. In recent years, we've become more refined. Robert Lucas said we have to design models that are robust to changes in policy, and this is a very fundamental idea, which will be driving the rest of this course, is which models do we want to look at? Which kind of models will we think about that show how agents can make mistakes and still recover from those mistakes, and the recovery process from these mistakes are what we call the business cycle. Okay, so we talked about Slutsky before. The next part of the course, tomorrow we'll talk, next week, next year, we'll talk about the ASAD model as a source of understanding, a very, very primitive undergraduate level way of understanding. So if you don't remember how that works, check out the appropriate chapters. We'll end up thinking about how these shocks, these mistakes, are culminated into cycles, because it's not just enough to have a shock, a one-time shock, but you want to see how the economy adjusts to that shock over time. So that's going to be partially a way of transmitting or transferring shocks that are purely random in the sense of this time series, white noise, serially uncorrelated, constant variance, means zero shocks, into something like this. So we'll show in January how these random shocks can be actually propagated into a cycle that looks like very similar to what we'd see if we looked at the data for inflation or for output growth. So this is what I call Slutsky's vision. It's basically the idea that that's enough to generate a business cycle. These types of unanticipated shocks that get propagated over time through the economic theory. So my vision of Slutsky, here's my vision of the holidays. Have a happy holiday, and I'll see you next year. Here are the key concepts to remember, and have a nice vacation. Thank you.